Hello, and thanks for joining us for the France 24 debate. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Now, the US President Donald Trump is this Thursday in a city he once described as a hellhole for talks with leaders from an alliance he once called obsolete. So perhaps it's no surprise that Trump's welcome in Brussels, the fourth stop on his 9-day international tour, has been markedly less warm than on other stops so far on what is his first overseas trip since taking office. Well, he's holding what are being described as tough talks with the NATO leaders, some of them still rattled by questions raised by the new president on the relevance of the decades-old military alliance. So has Trump changed his tune towards NATO, and is NATO now feeling more reassured about the new president of the United States? And is Trump bringing anything new to the table there in Brussels which might bring about change for the better? Well, here to discuss those questions and a whole lot more with me, I'm joined here in the studio by Georgi Kuzmanovic, who is a spokesperson for France Insoumise, the far-left political party headed up by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. You're also a specialist on defence and foreign affairs issues. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Left will be enough, not far left.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, to my left is Stuart Hogan, former president of Republicans Abroad France. Welcome back to France.
To your left, but to the right of Georgie. Yeah.
Yes, politically speaking. Let's go to Brussels, where Fabrice Potier is standing by. Fabrice is the former head of policy planning in the office of the NATO Secretary General, now a senior associate for the director of the Ukraine project at Rasmussen Global. Thank you so much to you. And in Berlin, standing by for us is Tyson Barker, the program director and fellow at the Aspen Institute, also a former senior advisor in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department. And if I am correct, you advised the Clinton campaign on European issues during the 2016 presidential election. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for joining us. So let's go to Fabrice in Brussels, because of course, Fabrice, we've seen President Trump having the red carpet rolled out for him in the Middle East. He had that trip to the Vatican, which was described as fantastic. Not quite such friendly territory for the Trump delegation there in Brussels. How's he been received?
Well, he had a blue carpet, maybe not red, but blue. I think he's been received as well as the head of the main NATO ally should be received. But I'm not sure he has reciprocated that. If you listen to the speech he gave at the inauguration of the 9/11 memorial, he's been very short in confirming the US commitment, but quite long in criticizing European leaders for not spending enough. So I would say that this is a bit a slap in the face of the European allies, and he has not answered the big question, which is the US fully committed to its European allies at NATO?
Let me go to Tyson in Berlin. Let me ask you for your thoughts. Do you think NATO leaders there in Brussels are feeling more reassured than perhaps they did at the start of this Thursday?
Well, it was undoubted that this was going to be the choppiest portion of this 7-day trip. And I think that it was obviously highly scripted. And in the end, it turned out as well as can be expected. I mean, the three big takeaways, which are, I think, the three takeaways that he wanted to leave NATO leaders with, was one, this needs to be an alliance that shifts its emphasis towards counterterrorism. And of course, he got the deliverable that he was looking for in that regard with the joining of NATO into the anti-ISIS coalition. The second was obviously the point that he hit on very hard during his remarks, that NATO members need to meet their 2% commitment more quickly than was committed to in Wales. And the third, and I think that this is where that there are some issues, is there was no mention, a reaffirmation of Article 5, that basically the U.S. defending the border of Latvia is the same as the U.S. defending the border of Maine. And that's going to leave some questions, particularly with allies that are much more concerned about the threat from the east than the threat from the south.
Let me ask you, Georgia, this is a president who described along the campaign trail NATO as being an obsolete institution, irrelevant. So many might be asking, why is he there?
Well, I don't know. I'm not one of Mr. Trump's supporter, and I'm not American, so I can speak for France, for Mr. Mélenchon, for France Insoumise. But what we think is that he do not really consider that NATO is obsolete. It was just words during the campaign, and the time will pass. and Trump will be more and more adequate to NATO. And I'm pretty sure that with the next wars, it will be very fine for everybody.
Stuart, last but not least, you're, of course, the former president of Republicans abroad, so perhaps you know more about what's going through Mr. Trump's mind than anyone else. But, you know, were those just words on the campaign trail, or did he have a serious point?
No, I don't think they're just words. I think they're establishing putting a stake in the ground for negotiation purposes, and I think, as you might even agree, we've already seen some substantial shifts in the position of some of the leaders of NATO countries and the NATO mechanism itself in terms of trying to move more into what Trump would determine to be a functional and normalized organization in today's world, as opposed to an obsolete one, which is, I think, the focus on terrorism and the willingness to spend what is if you want an alliance to work, typically you should live up to your alliance obligations, and there are only 5 countries, as I recall, out of how many are there? 27?
28. And it will be 29 with
but there are only 5 countries that actually live up to that 2% spending. Now, if you want to renegotiate that 2% floor, that's something to be done, but it's not to just be ignored and left randomly loose.
But still, these are talks, because the 2% thing was already asked by Obama, if I remember well.
And there has been an increase in funding since 2015.
It was an increase in funding. But what is real is that the deployment of new troops since January with 2,600 military vehicles from the United States is still there. Trump never said anything against that new deployment of troops. And the anti-missile, the shield, which is on the border of Russia, is still there. Nobody's speaking about that. So that's why I'm saying
no, I think he's I mean,
the main thing are continuing.
I think he's a fan of NATO. He just wants NATO to listen and get into the 21st century as opposed to the late 20th century.
Let's put that to Tyson, since Tyson, you're at the other end of the political spectrum from Stuart. I mean, Donald Trump's got some pretty good points, hasn't he? Difficult to argue that shaking up the status quo at NATO surely isn't such a bad thing, is it?
I mean, clearly anything that shakes all the allies out of any type of complacency that has set in after the Cold War is important. That said, the points that he brings up about counterterrorism are not new. Obviously, 9/11 brought counterterrorism squarely in the focus of the NATO mission. I mean, essentially, if you think about it, the first time that Article 5 was invoked by allies on behalf of the United States was essentially in response to a terror attack, and its operations in Afghanistan had a counter-terrorist thrust to them. So these points aren't necessarily new. What is new is the learning curve that Donald Trump himself is on, getting to know the alliance, getting to know the alliance's character, the character of the players involved in the alliance, and what might be necessary to move it to focus on other areas. Now, the one thing that's really important for him and his team to realize is that NATO isn't necessarily just about counterterrorism. It's about collective defense more broadly. And obviously, the concerns of different members are different. So we don't want to split the alliance when the concerns, say, of newer NATO member states are more regarding territorial defense from a resurgent Russia. I think it's also important to bring up, and yes, the 2% marker written into the Wales communique in 2014 was an Obama-led initiative, but it was in response to Russia's action in Ukraine. So a lot of what we've seen, a lot of this shaking of complacency was in response to a resurgent Russia, and this needs to be on the table.
Yeah, and this issue of Russia, let me go to Fabrice to talk a little bit more about it, because, of course, there is a lot of suspicion, not just in the United States, but also outside the United States, regarding President Trump's admiration for Russia, his possible ties to Russia. And that means there's a bit of a trust issue, isn't there, here, really, in this relationship between the new president and all of those present in Brussels today?
Yeah, just before answering the Russia question, let me just comment on some of the things that were said earlier. I think the risk here is to have a double Trump effect. On one hand, indeed, his brash messages have put extra pressure on the European allies to spend more. 2% already existed before, but now there's a new sense of urgency. And in a way, this is a good thing. But the problem is coming from Trump, and the way he delivers the message is alienating European leaders. And what you see is the second effect where I think the Europeans are going to spend more, but they're going to use NATO less because they trust the US a bit less. And I think this is the risk that the alliance is facing right now. On the Russia question, you're absolutely right. And I think President Tusk earlier today said it very clearly that him and President Trump could agree on many things, but on Russia, there was no 100% agreement, which is, I guess, an understatement coming from President Tusk. And this is really a core issue for the alliance, something that they are not ready to discuss today because they want to keep the meeting short and I would say light on substance. But that notion of how we're going to contain better and also engage better with Russia is something that is left to later. But the problem is there are deep divisions inside the alliance, and not only between the European allies and the US, but also within the European allies themselves. And I think this is where you need a strong US voice to set a direction on how we are going to deal with the Russia factor in Europe.
Stuart, how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for bringing up the history. The 2%, as I understand it, was not created in Wales. It was reaffirmed in Wales by Barack Obama. The 2% commitment to spending,
2006.
no, it predates, yeah, and it was never delivered by the vast majority of NATO countries. That said, I think that the question is, because Barack Obama asked in a nicer fashion, did he get a better result? I think that there's, to a great extent, there is a Trump effect. He's brash, he's bold, he's obnoxious, he's arrogant, he's narcissistic. A lot of those traits he shares with our prior president, Barack Obama, as well.
Lots of things.
But he says things that shock people. But you know what? He gets their attention. And I think that he has the attention of NATO, just like he has the attention of Muslim countries, at least the Shia, I guess the Shias that he met with.
The Sunnis.
And he's got people's attention across a number of territories right now. And I don't think that anyone's desire to portray Donald Trump as a buffoon out there is accurate. I think this is a chess game. He plays it differently than a lot of people because he pounds on the table a lot. But I think what we're seeing here is he's not asking the way Barack Obama did. He's saying, here's what. I don't think NATO is going to be abandoned. I don't think is it Article 5?
Article 5.
I don't think Article 5 is at risk. In fact, I think Article 5 is in better hands under Donald Trump than it was under Barack Obama.
Let me ask you, I mean, do you think people take Donald Trump seriously in this kind of a form? We'll come back to you in just 1 second, Fabrice. Let me just ask you, George, do you think that people there are taking Donald Trump seriously? I mean, just responding to what Stuart said about the traits of Donald Trump, and some people saying he doesn't always sound like he's done his homework.
Well, I think they're taking Donald Trump seriously, but I would like to jump on what the gentleman in Berlin said. I forgot his name. Sorry.
Tyson.
About NATO. That NATO is about defense, but we consider that NATO is about war. That's why we want to try get out of NATO. It was 25.
So that's your position?
Yeah.
That you would like to be out of NATO?
Yeah, that's our position.
But you've been there, haven't you, once before?
Just a second.
I think
just a second.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify.
Let George finish his point.
I'll let you speak. It was 25 years of expansion toward Russia. There is this shield that we spoke about. There is military deployment, and there's all these wars in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. I serve under NATO flag in Afghanistan, and all these wars have bring more wars, more chaos, and more terrorist groups. So this is not working. And about containing Russia that Fabrice said, it's kind of funny. I have to remind you that it's NATO that's expanding. Once again, the shield, 700 American military bases around the world, hundreds of thousands of military soldiers around the world. Imagine if China was doing that, or Russia. Then they would have to be contained. It's NATO that has to be contained, not the others.
Let me ask Fabrice to respond to that, but in 40 seconds, we're running short of time. NATO is not about defense, it's about war. That's what my guest in the studio thinks.
I think at the core, NATO is about preventing war and intervening in crisis when there is no other solution than launching an intervention. And on the previous comments, I think the facts speak for themselves. Who has invaded a neighbor over the last few years? Russia. Who has put nuclear warheads right in the middle of Europe in Kaliningrad? Russia. So I think the country that is pushing, the country that is putting pressure on European allies and on the West in general is Russia. So NATO is not, actually NATO is pretty reluctant to get into the containment business.
You forgot Kosovo,
but it has no
I
choice
think.
Because Russia has played a fairly aggressive card over the last few years.
You forgot Kosovo.
You've had the last word, Fabrice, in this first half of the France 24 debate. Stay with us. I'll be back in just a few minutes' time. Stay tuned.